Welcome to a journey that will put you to sleep while teaching you about one of history's most fascinating and brutal conflicts. As your consciousness fades and your mind drifts toward rest, let the story of the Crusades unfold like a gentle tide, carrying you through centuries of faith, warfare, and human ambition. The year is 1095, and you're standing in a crowded field in Clermont, France. The November air bites at your skin as thousands of people press forward to hear Pope Urban II deliver what will become one of history's most consequential speeches. His voice carries across the assembly like thunder rolling over distant hills. Deus vult, the crowd begins to chant. God wills it. These two words will echo across 2 centuries of conflict, inspiring millions to take up the cross and march toward the Holy Land. But before we dive into that pivotal moment, let your breathing slow and your muscles relax as we explore what led to this extraordinary call to arms. Picture the world of the 11th century, a time when maps ended in mystery and most people never travelled more than a day's walk from their birthplace. The Christian world felt small and embattled, surrounded by forces that seemed determined to swallow it whole. In the East, the Byzantine Empire, that last flickering remnant of Rome's ancient glory, struggled desperately to survive. Emperor Alexios Komnenos ruled from Constantinople, a city that straddled 2 continents and 2 worlds. His empire had once stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates, but now Turkish armies pressed ever closer to his capital. The Seljuk Turks, these fierce nomadic warriors who had swept out of Central Asia, had already conquered much of Anatolia, the empire's heartland. Let your mind drift back to that terrible day in 1071, when everything changed at a place called Manzikert. Emperor Romanos IV had led his army into the Armenian highlands, confident in his ability to push back these Turkish raiders. But confidence meant nothing when faced with the tactical genius of Sultan Alp Arslan. The battle that followed became a catastrophe beyond imagination. For the first time in 7 centuries, a Roman emperor fell captive to an enemy. As you sink deeper into relaxation, imagine the horror that rippled through the Christian world when news of this defeat spread. It wasn't just a military loss, it was a sign that perhaps God himself had turned his face away from his chosen people. The Turks didn't stop at Manzikert. They poured into Anatolia like water through a broken dam, establishing themselves in cities that had been Christian for 1,000 years. Nicaea, where the Great Council had once defined Christian doctrine, became the capital of a Turkish sultanate. Antioch, where the followers of Christ had first been called Christians, fell under Muslim rule. Jerusalem itself, though still technically controlled by the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, seemed more distant than ever from Christian pilgrims. As your breathing becomes deeper and more rhythmic, transport yourself to one of those pilgrim journeys. You're walking the dusty roads that lead to Jerusalem, part of a small group of believers who have sold everything they owned to make this sacred journey. The road is dangerous, filled with bandits and suspicious local authorities. Each night you huddle around a small fire, sharing bread and wine while singing hymns under the star-filled sky. When you finally reach Jerusalem, when you finally touch the stones where Christ walked, the joy is indescribable. But that joy is tinged with sadness because you know how precarious Christian access to these holy places has become. Back in Western Europe, the Church was experiencing its own transformation. The Gregorian Reform movement was reshaping Christianity, emphasizing the authority of the Pope and the spiritual purity of the clergy. Monasticism was flourishing, with new orders like the Cistercians attracting thousands of men and women seeking a life of prayer and contemplation. But alongside this spiritual renewal, came a growing militarization of Christian society. The Peace of God movement tried to limit warfare between Christians, but it also began to redirect that warrior energy toward external enemies. The concept of holy war was not new to Christianity, but it was evolving in fascinating ways. St. Augustine had written about just war centuries earlier, but now theologians were developing ideas about wars that weren't just permissible, but actually meritorious. Fighting for Christ could become a form of penance, a way to earn forgiveness for sins while serving God's purposes on earth. Knights who had spent their lives fighting each other over petty territorial disputes could now fight for something transcendent. Pope Urban understood all of these currents when he rose to speak at Clermont. He had received that desperate letter from Emperor Alexios, begging for military assistance against the Turks. The Pope saw an opportunity that went far beyond helping Byzantium. He could unite the fractious nobility of Western Europe under a single banner. He could assert papal authority over the entire Christian world. Most importantly, he could reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity. Listen to his words as they echo across the centuries. Let those who have been fighting against their brothers and relatives now fight in a proper way against the barbarians. Let those who have been serving as mercenaries for small pay now obtain the eternal reward. Let those who have been wearing themselves out in both body and soul now work for a double honor. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of people sewed crosses onto their clothing, symbolically taking the vow to march to Jerusalem. The word crusade itself comes from the Latin cruciata, meaning marked with the cross. These weren't just soldiers responding to the call. Entire families prepared to leave everything behind. Nobles mortgaged their lands to fund the expedition. Peasants sold their tools and livestock. Even women and children joined the movement, despite the obvious dangers. As sleep gently embraces you, imagine the chaos and excitement of those first preparations. Picture Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, selling his castle to fund his participation. Envision Raymond of Toulouse, already in his 60s, liquidating his vast holdings to lead the largest contingent. These weren't poor men seeking fortune. They were some of the wealthiest nobles in Europe, willing to risk everything for the promise of eternal salvation. But the organized nobility weren't the first to depart. In the spring of 1096, a charismatic preacher known as Peter the Hermit began leading what historians call the People's Crusade. Peter was a small weathered man who rode a donkey and claimed to have received a vision from Christ himself, commanding him to liberate Jerusalem. His preaching attracted thousands of poor people, minor knights, and social outcasts, who couldn't wait for the official expedition. The People's Crusade became a tragedy of epic proportions. These untrained, poorly equipped masses moved through Germany and Hungary like a plague of locusts, begging and stealing food as they went. When they reached Constantinople, Emperor Alexios was horrified. This wasn't the disciplined military assistance he had requested. Against his advice, Peter's followers crossed into Anatolia, where the Turkish Sultan Kilit Arslan was waiting. The massacre that followed was complete. Thousands died, and the few survivors limped back to Constantinople, their dreams of glory shattered. Even worse was the fate of other popular movements that never made it out of Europe. As you drift deeper into sleep, let your mind recoil from the horror of what happened in the Rhineland. Groups of crusaders, inflamed by religious zealotry and economic resentment, turned their fury against the Jewish communities of Germany. In cities like Mainz, Worms, and Cologne, entire Jewish quarters were destroyed. Thousands of innocent people died simply because they practiced a different faith. This dark side of the crusading movement, this transformation of religious enthusiasm into ethnic hatred, would stain the entire enterprise. But while these tragic preliminaries were unfolding, the main crusading armies were still preparing. These were serious military forces, led by experienced commanders. Godfrey of Bouillon gathered knights from the Holy Roman Empire. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman adventurer from southern Italy, brought his experienced soldiers who had been fighting Muslims in Sicily. Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the King of France, led French nobility. Raymond of Toulouse commanded the largest army, drawn from southern France and including many veterans of the Spanish Reconquista. The logistics of moving these armies were staggering. Tens of thousands of people needed to be fed, armed, and transported across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. Horses required fodder, soldiers needed weapons and armor, and everyone required food and water. The Crusaders developed supply chains that stretched across Europe, with Italian merchants providing ships and Greek officials organizing provisioning. It was perhaps the largest coordinated military effort Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. As winter turns to spring in your dreams, watch these great armies finally begin their march. The route to Constantinople became a river of humanity flowing eastward. Knights in glittering mail rode alongside their squires and servants. Priests carried relics and sang hymns. Engineers brought siege equipment, broken down for transport. Camp followers, including many women and children, provided essential services like cooking, nursing, and maintaining equipment. The journey to Constantinople took months, and it tested the Crusaders in ways they hadn't anticipated. Supply problems led to conflicts with local populations. Different national groups within the crusade began to develop suspicions about each other's motives. The Byzantine officials they encountered seemed more interested in extracting oaths of loyalty than in facilitating their passage. By the time these armies reached Constantinople in late 1096 and early 1097, their initial enthusiasm had been tempered by harsh realities. Emperor Alexios found himself in an impossible position. He had asked for military assistance, but what arrived at his gates were armies larger than his own, led by ambitious nobles who clearly had their own agendas. The negotiations that followed were delicate and complex. Alexios wanted the Crusaders to swear oaths promising to return any former Byzantine territories they conquered. The Crusader leaders were willing to make such promises, but they interpreted them very differently than the emperor intended. Let your sleeping mind witness the spectacular ceremonies in the great palace of Constantinople. Imagine these Western knights, many of whom had never seen a city larger than a few thousand people, suddenly confronted with a metropolis of 500,000 inhabitants. The wealth and sophistication of Byzantine civilization overwhelmed them. The Hagia Sophia, with its massive dome that seemed to float in the air, made their own cathedrals look like village churches. The emperor himself, dressed in silk and purple, surrounded by an elaborate court ritual, seemed like a figure from another world. But beneath the diplomatic niceties, tensions were already emerging that would shape the entire future of the Crusades. The Byzantines were primarily interested in recovering their lost territories in Anatolia. The Western Crusaders were focused on reaching Jerusalem. These different objectives would eventually lead to bitter conflicts, but for now, both sides needed each other. In the spring of 1097, the great adventure truly began as the Crusader armies crossed from Europe into Asia. Their first target was Nicaea, the Turkish capital that controlled the main route into Anatolia. The siege that followed revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the crusading movement. The Western knights were brave and well-equipped, but they had little experience with siege warfare in this climate. The Turks were skilled defenders who understood the terrain and could call on reinforcements. The siege of Nicaea lasted for weeks under the scorching Anatolian sun. As you sleep, imagine the sounds of this medieval siege. The thunderous crash of catapults hurling stones against the walls, the whistle of arrows filling the air, the shouts of men fighting hand-to-hand combat on scaling ladders. The Crusaders surrounded the city on 3 sides, but Nicaea sat beside a large lake, and Turkish boats continued to bring supplies and reinforcements. The breakthrough came when the Byzantines managed to transport ships overland to the lake, cutting off the city's waterborne supply line. Faced with inevitable defeat, the Turkish garrison negotiated a surrender with Emperor Alexios rather than with the Crusaders. This caused the first serious rift in the alliance. The Western Knights had expected to sack the city and claim booty to fund their expedition. Instead, they found Byzantine banners flying from the walls and their supposed allies controlling access to the city. Despite these tensions, the capture of Nicaea was a crucial victory. It opened the road to Jerusalem and demonstrated that the Turkish armies, formidable as they were, could be defeated. The Crusaders had faced their first major test and passed it, even if the victory left some bitter feelings about Byzantine intentions. As your breathing becomes slow and regular, follow the Crusader armies as they push deeper into Anatolia. The landscape they traversed was beautiful but treacherous. Rolling hills covered with scrub vegetation, river valleys that promised water but often proved to be dry, mountain passes where a small force could hold up an entire army. The heat was crushing for men accustomed to the cooler climates of northern Europe, and their heavy armour became almost unbearable under the blazing sun. The Turks, under Sultan Kilij Arslan, were far from finished. They had learned from their defeat at Nicaea and were preparing a new strategy. Rather than defending fixed positions, they would use their superior mobility to harass the Crusaders, striking when the Christians were most vulnerable and disappearing before they could respond effectively. Turkish mounted archers could fire arrows while riding at full gallop, a skill that European knights found both impressive and terrifying. The great test came at a place called Dorylaeum on July 1st, 1097. The Crusader army had divided into 2 groups for easier marching, and the Turks saw their opportunity. At dawn, thousands of Turkish cavalry swept down on the advance guard led by Bohemond. The attack was so sudden and fierce that it seemed the entire crusading movement might end before it had truly begun. Listen to the thunder of hoofbeats as wave after wave of Turkish horsemen charged the Crusader lines. Watch the arrows darken the sky like clouds of locusts. Feel the panic that rippled through the Christian ranks as their horses went down and their formation began to break apart. For hours, it seemed certain that this small force would be annihilated far from home, their dreams of Jerusalem dying in the dust of an Anatolian battlefield. But the Crusaders held. Bohemond organized his knights into a defensive circle, using their superior armor and discipline to withstand the Turkish assault. The archers and infantry, including many non-combatants, fought with desperate courage. Women and children helped carry water to the wounded and arrows to the defenders. Priests moved through the ranks offering absolution and encouragement. The battle turned when the Second Crusader army, led by Godfrey and Raymond, arrived on the battlefield. The Turks, committed to their attack on Bohemond's force, found themselves caught between 2 enemies. The fresh Crusader cavalry charged into their flank, and the Turkish army, which had seemed on the verge of victory, suddenly collapsed. Sultan Kilij Arslan's camp was captured, along with vast amounts of treasure that would help fund the rest of the expedition. Dorylaeum was more than just a victory, it was a revelation. The Crusaders had proven they could defeat the Turks in open battle. More importantly, they had learned to fight as a unified force despite their different nationalities and personal rivalries. The success gave them confidence for the challenges ahead and convinced many wavering supporters back in Europe that God truly was blessing their enterprise. As you sink deeper into peaceful sleep, let your mind wander through the months that followed. The Crusader armies pushed through central Anatolia, reclaiming city after city for Byzantium. The local Christian populations, many of whom had lived under Muslim rule for decades, greeted the Crusaders as liberators. Ancient churches were reconsecrated, and the sound of church bells rang again in communities that had been silent for a generation. But the march was taking its toll. The summer heat was merciless, and water was often scarce. Horses died by the thousands, forcing knights to fight on foot. Disease spread through the camps, claiming lives that Turkish swords had not been able to take. The Crusaders were learning that their greatest enemy might not be human opposition, but the harsh realities of campaigning in an alien environment. The first major division in the Crusader ranks occurred when Baldwin, Godfrey's brother, broke away from the main army with a small force. Baldwin was ambitious and pragmatic, and he saw opportunities in the political chaos of the region that were too good to pass up. He marched eastward into Mesopotamia, where he would eventually establish the first Crusader state in the county of Edessa. His success demonstrated that the Crusades were already becoming something more complex than a simple religious pilgrimage. Meanwhile, the main army approached its next great challenge, the ancient city of Antioch. As autumn turned to winter in your dreams, picture this magnificent city that had once been one of the greatest metropolises of the Roman Empire. Antioch sat astride the trade routes between Europe and Asia, protected by massive walls that stretched for miles around the city and up the steep slopes of Mount Silpius. It was here that the followers of Christ had first been called Christians, making its recapture symbolically crucial for the crusading movement. The siege of Antioch would become the defining experience of the First Crusade, a test that pushed the Crusaders to the very limits of their endurance. The city was too large to surround completely, and the Turkish garrison was well supplied and confident. Winter in northern Syria was cold and wet, a miserable contrast to the dry heat the Crusaders had endured in Anatolia. Food became scarce, then desperately short. Many Crusaders began to question whether they would ever see Jerusalem. Let the months of siege warfare wash over your sleeping consciousness, like waves against a shore. Picture the daily routine of men slowly starving while maintaining a military effort that seemed increasingly hopeless. Watch the deserters slip away in the night, including some prominent nobles who had sworn sacred oaths to continue the journey. Feel the growing desperation as news arrived that a massive Turkish relief army was marching to break the siege. The breakthrough came through treachery rather than military prowess. A Turkish tower guard named Firuz, possibly motivated by money or personal grievances, agreed to let the Crusaders into the city. On the night of June 3rd, 1098, Bohemond led a small force up the walls and opened the gates. The Crusaders poured into Antioch, and after months of siege, the city fell in a single night. But victory turned to crisis almost immediately. The Turkish relief army arrived just days after the city's capture, and now it was the Crusaders who found themselves besieged. They had captured Antioch only to become trapped inside its walls, with their enemies controlling the surrounding countryside. Food was even scarcer than it had been during the siege, and morale plummeted to new depths. It was at this darkest moment that the Crusaders experienced what they believed to be divine intervention. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received visions of St. Andrew, who told him that the lance that had pierced Christ's side was buried in Antioch's cathedral. Whether through genuine faith or desperate hope, the Crusaders excavated the cathedral floor and found what they proclaimed to be the Holy Lance. The psychological effect was electric. Men who had been on the verge of surrender suddenly found new strength. The discovery of the relic seemed to confirm that God had not abandoned them. that their suffering had a purpose. When they finally marched out to face the Turkish army, they fought with a ferocity that surprised their enemies and themselves. The Battle of Antioch was a complete victory for the Crusaders. The Turkish relief army, which had seemed so formidable, scattered before the Christian charge. The regional Turkish alliance that had threatened to destroy the crusading movement collapsed in a single day. The road to Jerusalem was open once again, but the victory at Antioch also created new problems. Bohemond claimed the city as his own, despite his oath to return Byzantine territories to Emperor Alexios. This decision established the Principality of Antioch, the Second Crusader state. But it also marked the definitive break between the Crusaders and Byzantium. The alliance that had made the expedition possible was dissolving just as success seemed within reach. As winter deepens in your dreams, watch the Crusader armies slowly reorganize for the final push toward Jerusalem. Many Crusaders considered their vows fulfilled with the capture of Antioch and returned home. Others were so weakened by disease and malnutrition that they could not continue. The force that eventually marched south toward Palestine was smaller than what had left Europe, but it was also more experienced and determined. The journey through Syria and Palestine revealed the complex political situation that the Crusaders were entering. The Muslim world was deeply divided between the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate based in Baghdad, the Shia Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, and various Turkish emirates that owed nominal allegiance to one or the other. These divisions had allowed the Crusaders to succeed, where a united Muslim response might have stopped them, but they also meant that any Crusader settlements would face constant pressure from multiple directions. Some Muslim leaders even allied with the Crusaders against their own religious rivals. The Fatimids, who controlled Jerusalem, had been fighting the Turks for decades and initially saw the Crusaders as potential allies against their Sunni enemies. This fragmentation of the Muslim response was crucial to Crusader success, but it also meant that the political situation remained fluid and dangerous. As your sleeping mind drifts through the Palestinian countryside, imagine the excitement that built as the Crusaders approached their ultimate destination. Jerusalem was more than just a city to these medieval Christians. It was the center of the world, the place where Christ had died and risen again. Many Crusaders had joined the expedition specifically to pray at the Holy Sepulchre, and some expected the Second Coming to occur once the city was back in Christian hands. On June 7th, 1099, nearly 3 years after Pope Urban's call at Clermont, the Crusader armies finally came within sight of Jerusalem. The emotional impact was overwhelming. Men who had endured incredible hardships, who had watched friends die of disease and battle wounds, who had questioned their faith and their mission, suddenly found themselves looking at the golden dome of the rock and the walls of the holy city. Many Crusaders fell to their knees and wept. Others began singing hymns of thanksgiving. The moment seemed to justify everything they had suffered, every sacrifice they had made. But the city still had to be taken, and the Fatimid garrison was well prepared for a siege. Jerusalem in 1099 was a formidable fortress. Its walls had been recently repaired and strengthened. The garrison was professional and motivated. Most importantly for the besiegers, the city's cisterns were full of water, while the surrounding countryside offered few reliable sources. The Crusaders found themselves in a race against time. They had to take the city before the Egyptian relief army arrived, or their own supplies ran out. The siege lasted just over a month, but it tested the Crusaders' engineering skills and determination. They had learned siege warfare during their long campaigns, and they applied those lessons with desperate efficiency. Wooden siege towers were constructed from timber brought from distant forests. Catapults hurled stones against the walls day and night. Miners worked to undermine the fortifications, while defenders poured boiling oil and Greek fire on the attackers. Let your sleeping consciousness witness the final assault on July 15th, 1099. Picture the massive siege towers rolling forward on their wooden wheels, their upper levels crowded with knights and crossbowmen. Watch Godfrey of Bouillon himself leap from a siege tower onto the city walls, his sword cutting through the desperate defenders. Feel the earth shake as sections of the wall collapse under the constant bombardment. When the walls were finally breached, the Crusaders poured into Jerusalem like a flood. What followed was one of the most controversial episodes in the entire history of the Crusades. For 3 days, Christian soldiers killed Muslims and Jews throughout the city. Contemporary accounts, probably exaggerated but still horrifying, describe blood flowing in the streets and piles of severed heads and hands. The massacre at Jerusalem was not unique in medieval warfare, but its scale and religious context made it particularly shocking. The Crusaders seemed to believe that they were carrying out divine justice, cleansing the holy city of those they saw as defilers. To modern sensibilities, their actions seem monstrous, but they must be understood within the context of 11th century religious thought and military practice. When the killing finally ended, the Crusaders faced the question of what to do with their conquest. Most of the expedition's survivors considered their vows fulfilled and prepared to return home. But someone had to govern the territories they had conquered, and that someone turned out to be Godfrey of Bouillon, who accepted the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre rather than king, claiming that he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. The establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem completed the creation of the Crusader states that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for the next 2 centuries. These 4 political entities, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, represented something unprecedented in medieval history. Western European feudalism transplanted to the Middle East. As your breathing becomes deeper and more peaceful, let your mind explore these remarkable political creations. The Crusader states were never more than narrow strips of territory along the coast and in the river valleys, islands of Latin Christianity in a sea of Islam. Their survival depended on constant vigilance, military innovation, and careful diplomacy with their Muslim neighbours. The Crusaders who remained in the East became a new type of European, the poulains, or pulleys, men who adapted to local conditions while maintaining their Western identity. They learned Arabic, adopted local architectural styles, and developed trading relationships with Muslim merchants. Some even formed military alliances with Muslim rulers against other Crusader lords. The rigid religious boundaries that had motivated the First Crusade began to blur in the practical realities of governing a diverse population. The military orders represented the most distinctive institutional development of the Crusader states. The Knights Templar, founded around 1119 to protect pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem, evolved into an international organisation with thousands of members and vast financial resources. The Knights Hospitaller, originally established to care for sick pilgrims, became equally militarised. These orders combined the religious devotion of monasticism with the martial skills of knighthood, creating something entirely new in Christian history. As sleep deepens around you like a gentle embrace, imagine these warrior monks in their distinctive white robes marked with red crosses. The Templars developed into Europe's first international banking system, using their network of commanderies to transfer money safely across vast distances. Pilgrims could deposit funds in Paris and withdraw them in Jerusalem, revolutionizing medieval finance. Their disciplined military formations became legendary, with rules that forbade retreat unless outnumbered more than 3 to 1. The success of the First Crusade sent shockwaves throughout both the Christian and Muslim worlds. In Europe, the victory was seen as divine vindication of the crusading ideal. Chronicles described miraculous interventions, angelic armies fighting alongside the Crusaders, and saints appearing to guide the faithful. The Pope proclaimed special indulgences for future expeditions, and recruitment for ongoing campaigns became a permanent feature of European religious life. But in the Muslim world, the Crusader conquest sparked a different kind of awakening. The initial response had been fragmented and ineffective, hampered by political divisions and mutual suspicions. However, the shock of losing Jerusalem gradually galvanized Islamic resistance. Religious scholars began preaching jihad with new urgency, calling for unity against the foreign invaders who had seized Islam's third holiest city. The first serious Muslim counterattack came from an unexpected direction. Ilghazi, the Turkmen ruler of Mardin, allied with other regional powers to challenge the most exposed of the Crusader states. In 1119, at a place called the Field of Blood, his forces virtually annihilated the army of Antioch. Prince Roger was killed along with most of his knights, and for a moment it seemed the principality might fall entirely. But the Crusader states demonstrated a remarkable resilience. Reinforcements arrived from Jerusalem and from Europe. New military tactics were developed, and the political structure proved flexible enough to survive even catastrophic defeats. The Field of Blood became a learning experience rather than a death blow, teaching the Crusaders that their survival depended on avoiding pitched battles unless absolutely necessary. Let your sleeping mind drift through the 1120s and 1130s, a period when the Crusader states seemed to stabilize and even prosper. Trade flourished between East and West, with Italian merchants establishing permanent communities in Acre, Tyre, and other coastal cities. The agricultural productivity of the region recovered from the disruptions of conquest, and the Crusader nobility began to see themselves as permanent residents rather than temporary occupiers. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem emerged as the most successful of the second-generation Crusader rulers. Unlike his predecessors, who had been shaped by the brutal experiences of the First Crusade, Baldwin understood that long-term survival required more than military prowess. He cultivated relationships with local Christian communities, including Armenians, Maronites, and Orthodox Greeks, who had lived in the region for centuries. Baldwin also recognized that the Crusader states could not survive in isolation. He negotiated carefully with the Byzantine Empire, seeking to repair the damage done by earlier Crusader betrayals. He maintained correspondence with European rulers, ensuring a steady flow of reinforcements and supplies. Most importantly, he began to exploit the divisions within the Muslim world, playing different factions against each other to prevent the emergence of a unified opposition. The second generation of Crusaders developed a distinctive culture that blended Western and Eastern elements. Crusader castles combined European military architecture with local building techniques, creating fortifications like Crac de Chevaliers that were virtually impregnable. Illuminated manuscripts from Crusader scriptoriums show artistic influences from Byzantine, Islamic, and Western traditions. Even Crusader law codes incorporated elements of local legal traditions alongside European feudal customs. But this period of relative stability was built on foundations that were inherently unstable. The Crusader states remained demographically tiny, with perhaps 120,000 Latin Christians ruling over a population that was predominantly Muslim, with substantial Orthodox Christian and Jewish minorities. Every military defeat potentially spelled doom, because there was no large population base from which to recruit replacements. More ominously, the Muslim world was beginning to produce leaders who combined political skill with genuine religious commitment to reconquest. Zengi, the Turkish governor of Mosul, spent the 1130s gradually building a coalition of Muslim powers united around the goal of jihad against the Crusaders. Unlike earlier Muslim leaders who had been content with raiding and tribute, Zengi aimed for nothing less than the complete expulsion of the Frankish presence. His opportunity came in 1144, when internal disputes weakened the county of Edessa. The most exposed of the Crusader states, either dust of broken truces settles like ash across the wine-dark plain as we enter the second phase of this ancient tale. The stage has been set with divine wrath and mortal pride. But now deeper currents stir beneath the surface of war. Where once we witnessed the fury of individual heroes clashing like bronze titans, we shall now observe how the very foundations of loyalty and honour begin to crack under the weight of prolonged conflict. The son of Peleus remains apart from battle, his terrible anger burning like an eternal flame beside his black ships. Yet his absence creates a vacuum that draws other forces into motion, forces that will test the bonds between men and gods, between duty and desire, between the living and the dead. For 9 years, this siege has consumed the flower of 2 civilizations, and now the accumulated weight of sorrow begins to work changes in even the mightiest hearts. Watch as Apollo, the far shooter, tends his faithful servants while Athena sharpens her strategies for the battles to come. Observe how mortal warriors, tested beyond endurance, discover reserves of courage they never knew they possessed. See how the women of Troy, from royal Andromache to the humblest servant, bear burdens that would break lesser spirits. This is not merely the continuation of a war, but the deepening of it. The moment when conflict transforms from adventure into tragedy, when heroes begin to understand the true cost of the glory they have sought. The Trojan prince Hector stands upon his city's walls, gazing across the corpse-strewn battlefield toward the distant Argive camp. 9 years of warfare have aged him beyond his mortal span, etching lines of care around eyes that once sparkled with youthful confidence. The bronze spear in his hand, polished smooth by countless battles, catches the morning light as he surveys the eternal stalemate that has become his life. Below in Troy's winding streets, the sounds of a city under siege create their own rhythm. Blacksmiths hammer bronze into weapons and armour, their forges burning day and night. Women weave at their looms, creating the cloth that will either dress warriors for battle or shroud them for burial. Children play games of war in the dusty courtyards, mimicking the heroes whose deeds they hear sung in the great hall, not yet understanding that those same heroes may soon lie cold beneath the earth. The great gates of Troy stand closed against the morning, their bronze fittings gleaming like captured starlight. Guards pace the battlements, their eyes scanning the plain for signs of enemy movement. But today brings no immediate threat of assault, only the grinding tension of siege warfare, where victory belongs not to the swift or the brave, but to those who can endure longest the slow corruption of hope. In the palace, King Priam sits upon his ivory throne, receiving reports from his commanders with the weary patience of a man who has heard too much of death. His white hair, once the crown of dignity, now seems a mark of premature aging brought on by the weight of his people's suffering. Beside him, Queen Hecuba maintains the appearance of royal composure, but her hands tremble slightly as she spins the wool that will become thread, that will become cloth, that will perhaps become shrouds for her sons. The royal council chamber echoes with familiar arguments about strategy and resources. How long can the city's granaries sustain the population? When will reinforcements arrive from distant allies? Can the walls withstand another determined assault? These questions have been asked and answered 1,000 times, yet they must be asked again, for the alternative is to surrender to despair. Hector's younger brother Paris, the shepherd prince whose beauty began this war, sits silent in the council. The golden armor he wears cannot disguise the haunted look in his dark eyes, the expression of a man who knows that thousands have died for his sake. Helen, the daughter of Zeus whose face launched 1,000 ships, rarely appears in public now, keeping to her chambers where she weaves scenes of the very war that was fought to reclaim her. Her beauty remains undiminished, but it has become a terrible burden, a reminder of the price that beauty can exact when it becomes the object of mortal desire. Yet Troy endures, as it has endured for 9 long years. The city's walls, built by the gods themselves in ages past, remain unbreached. The people continue their daily labours, finding in routine a kind of resistance to the chaos that surrounds them. The temples still echo with prayers and sacrifices, as priests beseech the immortals for protection and victory. Life, stubborn and resilient, continues even in the shadow of war. But on this morning, as Hector surveys the battlefield, he senses something different in the air. The quality of light seems changed, as if the sun itself shines with different intentions. The wind carries new scents across the plain, bringing with it the promise of events that will reshape the war's character. For though the son of Peleus remains apart from battle, his wrath has set in motion consequences that extend far beyond his personal grievance against Agamemnon. In the Argive camp, those consequences are beginning to manifest in ways both subtle and profound. The absence of their greatest champion has forced the other heroes to confront their own limitations and mortality. Ajax the Great, tower of Argive strength, finds himself bearing responsibilities that once shared between many. Diomedes, blessed by Athena with temporary divine power, has tasted what it means to fight like a god among mortals, only to discover that such gifts come with their own burdens. The common soldiers, those whose names will never be sung by poets, but whose spears and shields form the backbone of every army, go about their duties with the grim professionalism of men who have seen too much death to harbour illusions about glory. They sharpen their weapons, tend their gear, and share what little food remains from dwindling supplies, all while casting nervous glances toward the black ships where their greatest protector broods in magnificent isolation. Agamemnon himself, king of kings and leader of the great expedition, struggles with problems that victory in single combat cannot solve. His authority, once unquestioned, has been challenged by the son of Peleus's withdrawal from battle. Murmurs of discontent ripple through the camp as men begin to question whether their supreme commander possesses the wisdom necessary to bring this long war to a successful conclusion. The crisis deepens when divine intervention shifts the balance of power in ways no mortal strategy can counter. Zeus, bound by his promise to silver-footed Thetis, begins to turn the tide of battle against the Argives. What once seemed like minor setbacks in skirmishes around Troy's walls escalate into serious defeats that threaten the very foundations of the expedition. The first sign comes with the failure of a dawn raid against Trojan outposts. Argive warriors who have grown accustomed to easy victories over demoralized enemies suddenly find themselves facing defenders filled with renewed confidence and divine favor. The attack that should have succeeded within hours drags on through the morning, then into the afternoon, until finally the raiders are forced to withdraw with heavy casualties and nothing to show for their efforts. Word spreads quickly through the camp that something has changed in the cosmic balance. the priests who read omens in the flight of birds, and the patterns of sacrificial smoke report troubling signs. The auguries that once promised swift victory now speak of trials and tribulations ahead. Even the weather seems to have turned against them, as clouds gather on previously clear horizons and winds shift to favour Trojan ships over Argive vessels. But it is on the battlefield itself that Zeus's favour becomes most apparent. Hector, emerging from Troy's gates at the head of a column of allied warriors, seems transformed from the cautious defender he has been into something approaching divine inspiration. His bronze spear finds its mark with uncanny accuracy. His shield turns aside, blows that should have pierced any mortal defense, and his very presence on the field fills his allies with courage while striking fear into Argive hearts. The transformation is not lost on either army. Trojan warriors who have spent years in defensive positions behind their walls now advance across the plain with the confidence of men who believe the gods fight beside them. They press forward in disciplined formations, their bronze armor flashing in the sunlight, their war cries echoing off the ancient stones of their city's fortifications. Against this renewed Trojan confidence, the Argive response seems hesitant and disorganized. Without the son of Peleus to anchor their battle line, the individual champions find themselves unable to coordinate their efforts effectively. Each fights magnificently in isolation, but lacks the unifying presence that could weld them into an irresistible force. The pattern becomes clear as the morning advances. Where once Argive warriors could count on superior numbers and equipment to carry the day, they now face enemies who fight with the desperate courage of men defending their homes, and the divine favour of gods who have chosen to support their cause. The balance that has maintained the siege's stalemate for 9 years begins to shift decisively in Troy's favour. Ajax the Great, wielding his tower shield with the skill of long practice, finds himself giving ground for the first time in memory. The Trojan spears that rain against his bronze defence seem guided by supernatural accuracy, while his own counterattacks, though devastating when they connect, somehow fail to break the enemy formations as they once did. He fights with the same strength and courage that have made him legendary, but the very earth seems to resist his efforts. Diomedes, son of Tydeus, discovers that the divine favour which once allowed him to wound immortal Aphrodite and drive Ares himself from the battlefield has been withdrawn. His spear, which yesterday could pierce any armour, today finds its point turned by bronze that should offer no resistance. His chariot horses, once swift as the wind, now seem to labour as if pulling tremendous weights. The god-blessed warrior has become merely mortal again, and the transition proves more difficult than he had ever imagined. Even Odysseus, master of strategy and cunning, finds his usual tactical brilliance inadequate to the changed circumstances. Plans that should succeed through superior preparation and execution somehow go awry at crucial moments. Allied contingents fail to arrive at their designated positions on time. Supply lines that have functioned reliably for years suddenly become unreliable. It is as if the very cosmos has turned against Argive efforts, making success impossible despite their best efforts. The crisis reaches its crescendo when Hector leads a general assault against the Argive fortifications, the great wall that the invaders built to protect their camp. Those mighty stones dragged from nearby hills and blessed by their priests comes under attack from forces that seem to possess supernatural strength and determination. Where previous Trojan assaults have been repelled with relative ease, this attack threatens to overwhelm the defenders through sheer persistence and divine favour. The battle for the wall unfolds with the terrible intensity of mortal combat blessed by immortal intervention. Trojan warriors scale the fortifications with ladders that somehow resist being pushed away by the defenders. Stones hurled from the ramparts miss their targets by impossible margins, while Trojan arrows find gaps in Argive armor that should not exist. The very foundations of the walls seem to tremble under assault, as if the earth itself rebels against foreign presence. At the center of this supernatural storm stands Hector, transformed by Zeus's favor from skilled mortal warrior into something approaching a force of nature. His bronze spear cuts through enemy ranks like divine lightning, while his shield deflects weapons that should pierce any mortal defense. When he raises his voice in the war cry, even veteran Argive warriors feel their courage falter, as if they face not merely another champion, but the embodiment of Troy's divine protection. The Argive heroes rally to defend their fortifications with desperate courage. Ajax the Great plants himself before the main gate like a living tower, his massive shield covering the breach, while his long spear reaches out to strike down any enemy who approaches within range. Behind him, archers send volleys of arrows into the attacking ranks, while spearmen thrust through gaps in the wall to hold back the Trojan advance. Diomedes leads a counterattack along the eastern section of the fortifications, his bronze sword singing as it cuts through enemy ranks. Though he no longer possesses the divine favor that once made him invincible, his mortal courage and skill remain formidable. He carves a path through the Trojan assault force, buying precious time for his comrades to reorganize their defenses. Odysseus coordinates the overall defense with the tactical genius that has made him invaluable to the Argive cause. He moves constantly along the ramparts, reinforcing weak points, repositioning reserves, and maintaining the communication that keeps the defense functioning as a coherent whole. His presence provides stability in a situation that threatens to dissolve into chaos. But despite their heroic efforts, the Argive defenders find themselves slowly pushed back. The divine favor that protects the Trojan assault proves too powerful for mortal courage alone to overcome. Section by section, the Great Wall begins to crumble under attacks that seem guided by supernatural force. The unthinkable begins to seem inevitable. The fortifications that have protected the Argive camp for 9 years may finally be breached. It is at this moment of crisis that the true cost of the son of Peleus's withdrawal becomes apparent. The greatest warrior of the expedition remains in his tent, unmoved by the sounds of battle that grow ever closer to his own ships. His myrmidons, the elite fighters who could turn the tide of any engagement, sit idle beside their vessels while their comrades fight desperately for survival. The weapons that could save the day gather dust because pride proves stronger than duty. Yet even in this darkest hour, the bonds that hold the Argive coalition together refuse to break entirely. Veterans who have fought side by side for 9 years refuse to abandon their posts, even when the situation seems hopeless. Young warriors who have known no other life than this siege discover reserves of courage they never knew they possessed. The common soldiers whose names will never be remembered by history stand firm against odds that would break lesser men. The crisis deepens as Trojan forces finally breach the Great Wall at its weakest point. Through the gap, poor warriors who have dreamed of this moment for 9 long years, their bronze weapons gleaming with reflected firelight as buildings in the Argive camp begin to burn. The organized defense begins to fragment as units are cut off from central command and forced to fight as isolated bands of heroes. In this moment of apparent triumph for Troy, however, the seeds of future tragedy are already being sown. For Hector's success in driving the Argives back to their ships will set in motion the chain of events that leads to Patroclus donning Achilles' armor, to his death at Hector's hands, and to the terrible vengeance that will follow. The divine favor that makes this victory possible is the same force that will ultimately ensure Troy's destruction. The irony is lost on the combatants as they fight with desperate intensity for immediate survival. Trojan warriors press their advantage with the enthusiasm of men who see victory within their grasp. Argive defenders fall back toward their ships, not in panic, but in the controlled withdrawal of professional soldiers who understand that preservation of their forces matters more than holding every inch of ground. As the sun reaches its zenith, the battle reaches a turning point that will reshape the entire character of the war. The age of stalemate is ending, to be replaced by a period of rapid movement and decisive action that will test every participant to the limits of their endurance. The son of Peleus may remain apart from the fighting, but his absence has created conditions that will ultimately force him back into the conflict under circumstances that will make his previous anger seem gentle by comparison. The afternoon brings fresh horrors as Trojan forces, emboldened by their success against the Argive fortifications, push their attack toward the ships themselves. These black vessels, drawn up on the beach in careful rows, represent more than mere transportation. They are the lifeline that connects the expedition to its homeland, the means by which warriors might someday return to wives and children they have not seen for 9 years. Their destruction would transform a siege into exile, a military campaign into a fight for survival. Hector leads the advance with the terrible joy of a man who sees his city's deliverance within reach. The bronze point of his spear flashes like captured lightning as he cuts through the enemy ranks, while his voice rings out with commands that organize the attack into an irresistible tide of destruction. Behind him, Trojan allies who have traveled from the ends of the known world surge forward with renewed purpose, their various languages blending into a single cry of victory. The Lycians under godlike Sarpedon, son of Zeus himself, advance along the eastern flank with the disciplined precision of professional warriors. These men have served as mercenaries in conflicts across the ancient world, and their experience shows in the way they maintain formation even in the chaos of assault. Their bronze armour, marked with the symbols of distant mountains, gleams with an otherworldly light that speaks to their divine leadership. From the northern reaches come the Thracians, wild horsemen whose very appearance strikes fear into settled peoples. Their long hair flows behind them as they charge, their war cries echoing like wolf howls across the battlefield. These warriors fight not for gold or glory, but for the sheer joy of combat, and their presence adds an element of savage unpredictability to the Trojan assault. The Dardanians, led by noble Aeneas, son of Aphrodite and mortal Anchises, fight with the desperate courage of men defending their ancestral homeland. These warriors trace their lineage back to the founders of Troy itself, and they know that defeat means not merely military loss, but the extinction of their entire people. Their bronze spears thrust with the precision born of generational training, while their shields bear the ancient symbols of their royal house. Against this cosmopolitan alliance, the Argive defense begins to fragment. The loss of their fortifications has forced them to fight on ground of their enemy's choosing, while the absence of their greatest champion deprives them of the psychological advantage they have enjoyed throughout the war. Individual heroes continue to perform magnificent deeds, but lack the coordination necessary to mount an effective counterattack. Ajax the Great finds himself fighting a defensive battle along the ship's hulls, his tower shield providing the only barrier between Trojan firebrands and the vessels that represent his people's only hope of return. The bronze point of his long spear reaches out again and again to strike down enemies who approach with flaming torches, but there are always more attackers than he can handle alone. Sweat runs down his face beneath his bronze helmet, mixing with blood from minor wounds that accumulate despite his skill at defense. Diomedes rallies a group of Argive spearmen around the ship of his own contingent, organizing a defense that holds its ground through sheer stubborn courage. these warriors from Argos and Tiryns have followed their young lord across the wine-dark sea in pursuit of glory, and they refuse to disgrace themselves by fleeing in panic. Their bronze-tipped spears form a hedge of death that slows the Trojan advance, but cannot stop it entirely. Odysseus coordinates the overall Argive response with the tactical brilliance that has made him invaluable to their cause. He moves constantly between the various defensive positions, carrying orders and encouragement to isolated groups of fighters. His presence provides stability in a situation that threatens to collapse into complete chaos. But even his genius cannot solve the fundamental problem of fighting a defensive battle against superior numbers blessed with divine favour. The crisis deepens when Trojan warriors reach the ships themselves and begin attempting to set them ablaze. These vessels, constructed from cedar wood brought from the forests of Lebanon, will burn readily once the flames take hold. The sight of fire beginning to lick at the stern of the nearest ship sends a shock of terror through the Argive ranks. For they understand that the destruction of their fleet would mean death far from home for every man among them. It is at this moment of supreme crisis that divine intervention saves the expedition from immediate destruction. Poseidon, the Earthshaker, observes the battle from his underwater palace and decides that Zeus's favour toward Troy has gone too far. The god of the sea may not dare to directly contradict his brother's will, but he can provide subtle assistance that shifts the balance just enough to prevent total Argive collapse. The Earthshaker's intervention takes the form of renewed courage flowing through Argive hearts at their moment of greatest need. Warriors who moments before seemed on the verge of breaking suddenly find fresh strength in their limbs and new determination in their spirits. The bronze of their weapons seems to shine with inner light, while their shields feel lighter and their spears more balanced in their hands. Ajax the Great feels the change first, as divine strength flows through his massive frame like wine warming a man's blood. His tower shield, which had begun to feel impossibly heavy after hours of combat, suddenly seems as light as a child's toy. His long spear, which had started to drag with fatigue, now moves with the fluid grace of a serpent striking its prey. The war cry that breaks from his throat echoes across the battlefield like thunder from a clear sky. The effect spreads rapidly through the Argive ranks as Poseidon's divine favour counters Zeus's support for Troy. Warriors who had been giving ground steadily suddenly plant their feet and refuse to retreat another step. Spearmen who had been fighting defensively begin to push forward, their bronze points finding gaps in enemy armour with supernatural accuracy. The tide of battle, which had seemed to flow inexorably toward Trojan victory, begins to slow and then reverse direction. Diomedes leads a counterattack that carves deep into the Trojan formation, his sword singing as it cuts through enemy ranks with divine precision. The son of Tydeus may no longer possess the overwhelming power that once allowed him to wound immortal gods, but Poseidon's favour grants him strength enough to match any mortal warrior on the field. His battle cry rallies the Argive spearmen around him, and together they begin to push the attackers back from the ships. The renewed Argive resistance catches the Trojan forces by surprise. Warriors who moments before had been advancing confidently toward what seemed like certain victory suddenly find themselves facing enemies who fight with supernatural determination. The easy triumph that had appeared within their grasp begins to slip away as divine favour shifts once again between the opposing sides. Hector, sensing the change in cosmic balance, redoubles his own efforts to break through the Argive defence. The greatest of Priam's sons understands that this moment represents Troy's best chance for decisive victory, and that failure now might mean the loss of their one opportunity to end the siege on favourable terms. His bronze spear flashes like lightning as he seeks a weakness in the enemy line, while his voice rings out with commands that attempt to maintain Trojan momentum. But even Hector's magnificent courage cannot entirely overcome the shift in divine favour. The warriors who had followed him with such confidence begin to hesitate as they encounter resistance that seems to grow stronger rather than weaker. The ships that had seemed ready to burst into flames somehow resist the torches thrust against their hulls, while the Argive defenders appear to multiply rather than diminish as the battle continues. The stalemate that results from this clash of divine influences creates some of the most intense fighting the war has yet witnessed. Neither side can gain decisive advantage, but neither can afford to withdraw from positions they have purchased with so much blood. The space between the ships and the breach in the Argive wall becomes a killing ground where heroes fall like grain before the Reaper's blade. In this crucible of combat, individual acts of heroism shine like stars against the darkness of mass slaughter. Sarpedon and his cousin Glaucus lead a Lycian assault that nearly reaches the ships before being driven back by Ajax's counterattack. Aeneas and Hector coordinate their efforts to break through the Argive centre, only to find themselves facing Diomedes and a picked band of Argive champions who refuse to yield another step. The battle rages through the afternoon without decisive result, as divine favour shifts back and forth between the opposing forces. Zeus's support for Troy contends with Poseidon's assistance to the Argives, creating conditions where mortal courage and skill matter more than supernatural intervention. The warriors on both sides fight with the knowledge that everything they have struggled for hangs in the balance of this single engagement. As the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, painting the battlefield in shades of bronze and crimson, the intensity of combat reaches levels that test even veteran warriors to their limits. Men who have fought for 9 years discover reserves of strength and determination they never knew they possessed. The very air seems to crackle with tension as heroes push themselves beyond all previous boundaries of endurance. Yet despite the magnificent courage displayed by warriors on both sides, the fundamental dynamics of the conflict remain unchanged. The son of Peleus continues to brood beside his ships, his terrible anger unassuaged by the desperate battle raging around him. His Myrmidons, the finest fighters in the Argive host, remain idle while their comrades die for want of their spears. The weapons that could turn the tide of battle gather dust because pride proves stronger than duty. The irony of the situation is not lost on those who understand the larger patterns at work. The very crisis that threatens to destroy the Argive expedition is creating the conditions that will eventually force the son of Peleus back into battle under circumstances that will make his previous withdrawal seem insignificant by comparison. The divine favour that enables Hector's success is the same force that will ultimately ensure his destruction. But for now, in this moment of desperate struggle, such larger patterns remain invisible to the combatants who fight with everything they possess for immediate survival. The battle continues to rage as darkness approaches, each side knowing that the next few hours may determine whether Troy stands unconquered or falls in flames, whether the Argive expedition returns home in triumph or perishes on foreign shores, far from the graves of their ancestors. The approaching night brings with it the promise of temporary respite from combat, but also the knowledge that tomorrow will bring fresh challenges and new tests of courage. For this war has passed beyond the point where simple military victory can resolve the fundamental tensions that drive it. Too much blood has been spilled. Too many heroes have fallen. Too many oaths have been sworn in the presence of the gods for any easy resolution to be possible. The second phase of this ancient tale draws to its close with the recognition that the conflict has entered a new and more dangerous stage. The age of stalemate is ending, to be replaced by a period of rapid movement and decisive action that will test every participant to the limits of their humanity. The son of Peleus may remain apart from the fighting, but forces are already in motion that will drag him back into the conflict under circumstances that will transform his personal anger into something far more terrible and far more consequential. As the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky above the wine-dark plain, both armies draw back from the field of slaughter to tend their wounds and count their losses. The temporary cessation of combat brings not relief but grim recognition of how much the day's fighting has cost both sides. The ground between Troy's walls and the Argive ships lies carpeted with bronze and flesh, testament to the fury that divine intervention can unleash when immortal wills clash through mortal instruments. In the Trojan camp, Hector strips the blood from his spear and armour as his captains gather around him in the flickering light of torches. The greatest of Priam's sons has led his people closer to decisive victory than any previous effort has achieved, yet he knows that the opportunity may already be slipping away. The divine favour that blessed their assault shows signs of wavering, while the Argive resistance has proven more resilient than even his most pessimistic advisors had predicted. "We have driven them to their ships," announces Sarpedon, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a warrior who has seen his enemies flee before him. The Lycian prince bears fresh wounds from the day's fighting, but his spirit remains unbroken by the ordeal. One more assault like today's and their black hulls will burn on the beach while their crews flee across the wine-dark sea. But Hector's expression remains troubled as he gazes across the darkened battlefield toward the enemy camp. Something in the afternoon's fighting has disturbed him. Some shift in the cosmic balance that his warrior's instincts detect, even if his mind cannot fully comprehend its implications. The resistance they encountered grew stronger rather than weaker as the battle progressed, suggesting forces at work beyond simple mortal courage. "The Earthshaker intervenes," murmurs Polydamas, wisest of Troy's counsellors, his weathered face grave in the torchlight. "I felt his presence in the way the enemy ranks reformed when they should have broken, in the strength that flowed through Argive spears when their wielders should have been exhausted. Zeus favours us, but his brother favours our enemies." The observation sends a chill through the assembled commanders, for they understand its implications. If the gods themselves are divided over the war's outcome, then mortal efforts alone may prove insufficient to achieve decisive victory. The intervention of Poseidon suggests that the cosmic forces supporting Troy's cause are not as unified as they had hoped, creating conditions where their greatest successes may be countered by divine opposition. Aeneas, son of Aphrodite, speaks with the authority of one whose divine heritage grants him insight into immortal affairs. "The blessed ones play their own games with mortal lives," he observes, his voice carrying both reverence and bitterness. "We are pieces on their board, moved according to purposes we cannot fully understand. Our role is to fight with courage, regardless of the outcome they decree." The Dardanian prince's words remind the assembly that they are not merely warriors fighting for tactical advantage, but participants in a cosmic drama whose ultimate resolution lies beyond their control. Yet this recognition does not diminish their determination to pursue victory through their own efforts, for the alternative is to surrender agency entirely to forces beyond mortal influence. In the Argive camp, a similar council takes place around the dying embers of cooking fires, though the mood there carries undertones of desperation absent from the Trojan gathering. The near breach of their fortifications has shaken even veteran campaigners who have survived 9 years of siege warfare. The proximity of total defeat has forced them to confront the possibility that their great expedition might end not in glorious victory, but in catastrophic annihilation. Agamemnon sits silent among his captains, the weight of supreme command evident in every line of his posture. The King of Kings has spent the day watching his carefully constructed coalition nearly disintegrate under divine pressure, and the experience has taught him hard lessons about the limits of mortal authority. His royal regalia seems somehow diminished in the flickering firelight, as if the bronze and gold have lost their power to inspire awe. We cannot withstand another assault like today's. Ajax the Great states, with the blunt honesty that characterizes his approach to all challenges. The Tower of Argive's strength bears multiple wounds from the day's fighting, but his voice remains steady as he delivers his assessment. Our wall is breached, our ships are threatened, and our men fight with the desperation of cornered animals rather than the confidence of conquering heroes. Diomedes nods grimly at his comrade's words, his own experience confirming the dire nature of their situation. The cosmic balance has shifted against us, he observes. The silence that falls over the battlefield when the last trumpet fades is not the silence of peace, but of exhaustion. For nearly 2 centuries, the Christian kingdoms of Western Europe have hurled themselves against the fortified cities of the Holy Land, like waves against an unyielding shore. Jerusalem has been won and lost and won again. Antioch has seen its streets run red with the blood of both cross-bearer and crescent-bearer. The dream that began with Pope Urban's thunderous call at Clermont in 1095 has transformed into something far more complex than those first zealous pilgrims could have imagined. As the 13th century dawns, the crusading movement stands at a crossroads. The great victories of the First Crusade seem like distant memories, faded tapestries hanging in the halls of kings who now face very different challenges. The unified Muslim resistance under Saladin has given way to a fractured political landscape, where Ayyubid princes compete with Mamluk strongmen for dominance over the Levantine coast. The Crusader states themselves have evolved from the rough military colonies established by Godfrey of Bouillon and his companions into sophisticated political entities that must navigate the treacherous waters of Near Eastern diplomacy. In Acre, the last great Christian stronghold on the eastern Mediterranean shore, merchants from Venice and Genoa haggle over spice prices in markets where Arabic mingles freely with Latin and French. The city's massive walls, rebuilt after Saladin's conquest and Richard the Lionheart's recapture, cast long shadows over a cosmopolitan population that includes not only Latin Christians, but also Eastern Orthodox believers, Armenian merchants, Syrian craftsmen, and even Muslim traders operating under carefully negotiated safe passage agreements. The military orders that once embodied the pure martial spirit of the crusading ideal have themselves become complex international organizations. The Knights Templar operate a banking network that stretches from London to Cyprus, their red crosses on white mantles, now as likely to be seen in counting houses as on battlefields. The Hospitallers have transformed their original mission of caring for pilgrims into a sophisticated medical and military operation that maintains hospitals throughout the eastern Mediterranean, while simultaneously fielding some of the finest heavy cavalry in Christendom. The Teutonic Knights, having found limited opportunities in the Holy Land, have turned their attention northward to the pagan tribes of the Baltic, where they pursue conquest and conversion with the same methodical efficiency their predecessors once brought to the siege of Jerusalem. Yet beneath this surface adaptation to new realities, the fundamental tensions that have always characterized the crusading movement continue to simmer. The Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, view the Eastern Mediterranean primarily as a theatre for commercial competition. Their magnificent fleets, as likely to fight each other as to transport pilgrims or provisions to the Holy Land. The Byzantine Empire, once the original petitioner for Western military assistance, now regards the Latin states as dangerous neighbours who have proven themselves quite capable of turning their weapons against Constantinople itself, as the horrific events of 1204 demonstrated. In Rome, the papal court struggles to maintain control over a movement that has repeatedly escaped the bounds of its original spiritual purpose. Pope Innocent III, perhaps the most powerful pontiff in Christian history, has expanded the concept of crusading beyond the Holy Land to encompass campaigns against heretics in southern France, pagans in the Baltic, and even political enemies of the papal state in Italy itself. This theological innovation has provided the Church with a powerful tool for enforcing orthodoxy and extending papal authority, but it has also diluted the special character that once made the Jerusalem pilgrimage a uniquely compelling spiritual exercise. The Fourth Crusade's catastrophic diversion to Constantinople continues to cast a shadow over all subsequent expeditions. The sight of Latin knights sacking the greatest Christian city in the world, melting down ancient icons for their gold content, and desecrating altars that had witnessed centuries of liturgical worship, has created a wound in the body of Christendom that shows no signs of healing. The Byzantine Empire, reduced to a rump state centered on Nicaea, views any Western military expedition with deep suspicion, while the newly established Latin Empire of Constantinople struggles to maintain legitimacy in the face of Greek Orthodox hostility and its own internal contradictions. Against this backdrop of political fragmentation and spiritual uncertainty, new voices begin to emerge that will fundamentally transform the nature of Christian engagement with the Islamic world. In the hills of Umbria, a young merchant's son named Giovanni di Pietro di Bernardone experiences a series of mystical visions that lead him to abandon his comfortable life for one of radical poverty and evangelical preaching. Francis of Assisi, as he will become known, represents a revolutionary approach to the Islamic world, not conquest through force of arms, but conversion through the power of Christian example and direct spiritual dialogue. The Franciscan mission to the Islamic world begins not with military planning, but with a radical act of faith. In 1219, as the Fifth Crusade besieges Damietta in the Nile Delta, Francis himself crosses the battle lines under a flag of truce and requests an audience with Al-Kamil, the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt. The meeting between the poverty-embracing Christian mystic and the sophisticated Muslim ruler represents a profound alternative to the military confrontation that has characterized Christian-Islamic relations for over a century. Contemporary accounts of this encounter, filtered through the hagiographical traditions that quickly grew up around Francis, suggest a meeting of remarkable mutual respect. Al-Kamil, grandson of the great Saladin and himself a patron of Islamic scholarship and poetry, receives the Christian holy man with courtesy and genuine interest. The Sultan's court includes scholars familiar with Christian theology, and the theological discussions that ensue reveal the sophisticated intellectual culture of Ayyubid Egypt, where Islamic, Christian, and Jewish traditions intersect in ways that the crude stereotypes of crusading propaganda had never acknowledged. Francis's approach to the Islamic world is revolutionary in its simplicity. Rather than seeking to demonstrate the superiority of Christian civilization through military conquest or political domination, he attempts to embody the radical love that he believes lies at the heart of the Christian message. His voluntary poverty, his care for the sick and outcast, his evident sincerity and lack of personal ambition create a profound impression on Muslim observers who have grown accustomed to associating Christianity with the violence and rapacity of crusading armies. The Franciscan missions that follow Francis's pioneering journey establish a new model for Christian engagement with the Islamic world. Unlike the military expeditions that sought to carve out territorial enclaves through force of arms, these missions operate through persuasion, example, and the gradual building of relationships across religious boundaries. Franciscan friars learn Arabic, study Islamic theology, and develop sophisticated apologetic arguments designed not to demonize Islam, but to demonstrate the truth of Christian revelation through rational discourse and lived witness. This new approach finds its most sophisticated expression in the work of Ramon Llull, a Catalan nobleman who experiences his own dramatic conversion and dedicates his life to the peaceful conversion of Muslims and Jews. Llull's Art of Finding Truth represents an ambitious attempt to develop a logical system capable of demonstrating Christian truth in ways that would be compelling to adherents of other monotheistic traditions. His repeated journeys to North Africa, his mastery of Arabic language and Islamic philosophy, and his eventual martyrdom in Bougie in 1315 establish him as the prototype of a new kind of Christian missionary, one who seeks to understand rather than merely to conquer. Yet even as these new approaches to Christian-Islamic dialogue develop, the traditional military framework of the crusading movement continues to evolve in response to changing political circumstances. The Fifth Crusade, launched in 1217, represents an attempt to learn from the strategic mistakes of previous expeditions. Rather than targeting Jerusalem directly, the expedition's planners recognized that control of Egypt is the key to sustainable dominance over the entire eastern Mediterranean region. Egypt's agricultural wealth provides the economic foundation for Ayyubid power, while its position astride the trade routes between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean makes it the natural center of any successful Islamic coalition. The siege of Damietta becomes a test case for new approaches to crusading warfare. The city's position on the Nile Delta requires the development of naval capabilities that previous expeditions have lacked.